Please welcome Kevin and Mer.
Our intent for tonight, first of all, we want to thank you for having us. Really honored for the privilege to share with you. And ideally, for every one of these moments, we can have this be a two-way dialogue. What we'll begin to do is to share a little bit about our backgrounds and perspectives in terms of the paths that we've traveled. I'll go first, Lamar will go next, and then we definitely want to open up for any questions, curiosities, even observations that you have from your paths. We can go back and forth from that. Sound good? Cool. Again, thank you all for coming. So again, my name is Kevin Bethune, Vice President of Strategic Design at BCG Digital Ventures. I lead one of two design cohorts that we have in our model that very much is a multidisciplinary mix of designers, technologists, and business folk that come together to really envision startups for some of the world's largest companies. So we essentially envision these new startups, new to world businesses for a lot of these large corporates that have a difficult time really prioritizing innovation in a thoughtful and multidisciplinary way. We work together most of the time, where a lot of the folks that live in these large corporates, they only get to do that some of the time. And so we make an ideal partner to bring these new to world businesses because of the startup audacity that we bring to the table. And in doing so, we also leverage the subject matter expertise that are in these large corporates. So working together, we can definitely work like a Silicon Valley startup, but have the advantages that the large corporate brings to the table. So to start, I just want to share a little bit about the background, and it definitely informs sort of the origin story of the company that we work for presently. And where my early volition came from, like many of you, was just having that innate creative desire in my youth. I drew and sketched for hobby all the time, but I didn't necessarily know about design until much later in my career path. But based on where the world's going with this ongoing convergence of disciplines crashing together, I'm very thankful for the timing. So in terms of picking conventional paths, it was either business or engineering as I was growing up. And because of the intersection of the sciences and technology, like mathematics as well, engineering made more sense for me. So I started my career as a mechanical engineer in the nuclear power generation space. So I stared down the barrel of many of these nuclear reactor vessels across the US and South Korea, helping to extend the operating life of many of these nuclear plants. Also, the projects took me over to South Korea quite a bit, working to, again, upgrade these reactor systems. And that is actually the fuel sitting in the flooded nuclear cavity, and they're actually taking each fuel assembly out one at a time during the refueling effort. And to do that, we used long-handle tooling and robotics through roughly 30 feet of water to access those critical components below. And the metal around the fuel is just as radioactive and dangerous as the fuel itself. So we had to use these long-handle tooling apparatuses to ensure that we were working safely. And I think digital was not a necessity in this world, so constantly having to bridge together the realities of what you found inside the nuclear plant with some of the envisioned hardware upgrades that we were intending to make. That's actually a picture of me sitting on the containment wall on the left side, and we actually built that yellow crane, and half of it is in the water, half of it is above the water, and that essentially was a useful crane to move the long-handle tooling in and out of position to do the things that we needed to do. So I'm very much thankful for this experience because it taught me what it meant to actually make a good product that needed to meet the needs of many stakeholders and ensure that we were extending the safe longevity of these operating reactors. So CAD/CAM were par for the normal course. We were constantly simulating the performance of these nuclear plants, as well as postulating accident scenarios and ensuring that the plant could respond to those events. But we also had to compare that constantly with classical theory. So the classical disciplines of physics, mathematics, we had to make sure that we were checking the rational comparisons between all the techniques that we used. And even that wasn't enough. We had to test everything. We had to mock up everything and run simulations physically to ensure that we had the best course of action understood. So the engineering opportunities definitely sparked some some curiosities for business, what role business played in that initial chapter of career. And those curiosities naturally led me to consider business school, to really layer in that business acumen on top of the technology background. And so business school is a great opportunity to really take a step back and look at the career with fresh eyes. But honestly, it was a difficult time because there were so many voices in that business school environment. Many voices saying, what you should do with your career after you graduate. There were voices saying, oh, you need to go in this path because that's where you're going to make the money. There's voices saying you need to go in this path because that's where the power and influence is. And honestly, it was a difficult time for me personally because I found my own sort of voice getting lost in the fray. I didn't know what someone coming from engineering should do when they think about adding that business layer. And it was sort of tough to figure that out. But thankfully, I think that creative itch that I had in my youth never died. And I actually then started experimenting in the midst of my business school classes, just experimenting for local entrepreneurs creatively, and just starting to cut my teeth, making bets on those skills. And I allowed that creative curiosity to inform the type of company I work for post-graduation. And thankfully, Nike Inc. was at the top of that short list of companies that embodied some degree of creativity alongside the business and the technological aspects. And again, not knowing what I would do with the creative side, that's where the itch was pulling me. And thankfully, I had an opportunity to work for Nike Inc. from graduation. So I landed at World Headquarters, which is at Beaverton, Oregon. And what an amazing place to navigate fresh out of business school with this new language that I could now use in a real publicly traded company, and one that was working on such inspirational product and inspirational brand stories. But the product person within me, the curious creative within me, was looking for ways to really find those areas within Nike where that stuff was happening. And so after roughly about a year and a half, I left my business role and entered the product engine in an operational capacity, armed to really help the creative community at Nike figure out how to further proliferate the latest in 3D and 2D digital capabilities in the product creation process. And so the task that we had was to really bring a lot of lean and new digital creation techniques into what was a conservative and conventional physical product creation process. And just a few of the paradigms that we were looking to wrestle with, we definitely wanted to ensure the product teams had an eye on top quality, but hopefully being able to do it at a lower cost, and hopefully introduce more flexibility into the value chain as we were creating this product. And ideally, we could get the product teams to wait as long as possible before they started work to ensure that they were working off the latest insights available. Many people don't know that most of the shoes that you're wearing probably take on the order of 18 to 24 months to actually launch and market from when a designer first puts pen to paper. It's a very long, arduous process with a lot of stage gates and filters. And so as much as we could shorten that lead time to bring the product teams closer to the consumer insight, that was the goal. And ideally, teach the teams to work together in a more multidisciplinary manner so that there could be mutual trust and respect across the board as we worked. And so now this is a new world where we would ask a footwear designer, in this case, to actually articulate their design intent on a 3D foot form versus sending a napkin sketch over to a factory offshore and waiting weeks for that sample to come back, realizing that the factory probably hit maybe 30% of what the design intent was, and having that designer have to send markups back to the factory. And you can imagine these samples going back and forth across the ocean, how much time we're losing, and how much guessing that everyone's doing just to even be able to hit that initial design intent. So we wanted to create a world where we coached all the designers to articulate more clearly what they wanted in the first place so that we could spend more time on the soul of the product. Well, through that process, Also, the actual act of sample making, we also questioned, well, why do you actually have to cut multiple samples of different colors and materials for the same model of shoe? Well, we played with digital sampling techniques, photorealistic interpretations of how you could spin colors and materials on these footwear, just to accelerate how we think about the assortment of shoes hitting the store walls. So through that process, now my curiosity is afire because I'm meeting creatives for the first time professionally in my career, and it created an insatiable hunger to want to just learn and pick up some of the techniques. And thankfully, the Jordan brand actually opened the door for me and said, you know, we see you have these raw skills, you're doing this operational sort of job, but why don't you try your raw creative craft on the actual act of designing shoes? And so the Jordan brand gave me opportunities to cut my teeth on this particular story, which was combining the iconic Air Force One basketball shoe with the Air Jordan 8. A very sort of oddball Jordan shoe that was featured in the Bugs Bunny Space Jam cartoon, if you remember that, with Michael Jordan and all the Looney Tunes. And so we have two radically different designs. How do you even begin to figure out the form factor fusion of these two icons? And so we got to work. We sketched like crazy. I met with the Jordan creative director at 6 in the morning every morning, and we would work together, do work, then we would go do our day jobs. And then at night I'd work on his stuff and meet him the next day at 6 in the morning for a critique. And we worked that way for a better part of a year just to see where this could go. And we ended up cutting a few versions of the shoe story. So, you know, we followed the creative process, we diverged on multiple sketches, we converged on 2 iterations. And then because I had to drink the old Kool-Aid of what I was asking the designers to do across the board at Nike, I had to jump in the tools myself and actually execute and deliver that design intent in 3D. So we ended up doing a mid in regular materials and then a high version in luxe materials meant to be sold at a low run. Going through the sample dance, of course, but ideally with clear intent conveyed across the ocean. You know, sending red line markers on pattern files, learning the tricks of the trade, virtual sampling the shoes off the 3D files before I would eventually get the final physical samples, and bringing these things to market. And so this was one of 2 that made it on the store shelves, did really well 2010 during the summer and spring and summer seasons. So through that process, I would say the footwear design experience really helped me just, again, cut my teeth with some of those formal skills, but a few shoe projects wasn't enough to answer that full creative call. Meanwhile, bear in mind, I'm watching the world converge outside of Nike, where organizations like IDEO and special institutions like the D School, design, strategy, technology, all coming together, startups in Silicon Valley. So I knew the world was moving this way, and now my career path was starting to really embody this multidisciplinary cohesion of skills. And I really wanted to commit to living at the center and have my career stand for innovation for the rest of my career moving forward. But in order to make that commitment, a few shoe projects wasn't necessarily enough to answer that creative leg of the 3-legged stool. And so I had to make a hard commitment to really invest in myself, to make sure that I would have the capabilities to step forward with that commitment in mind, to step forward with confidence and credibility that I could do that. So that required further investment in my education. And so after 5 years at Nike, I quit my job and ended up entering the graduate industrial design program at Art Center, College of Design, not too far from here. And very much Art Center had changed in a unique way in that before, when you thought of Art Center, and especially the graduate program, you had to come from design to be a part of that graduate program. But around the time that I was getting serious about design school, Art Center had shifted its gears. It opened their aperture to consider folks from different disciplines to enter their graduate program. So now I was among the first cohort of folks that were coming in that represented a wide range of skills. I had a classmate who traversed the Harvard Medical School journey 3 years in, and that person decided that they didn't want to become a surgeon. They wanted to impact the medical room through design. And so they pivoted. So they stopped their Harvard Medical School journey and resumed their education at Art Center. Another classmate was a former marketing director of Coca-Cola who wanted to really embrace design skills to figure out how to move things forward in a different way. And so a lot of us were coming from these weird walks of life with this desire to pivot and be a part of this intersection moving forward. And still, I think Art Center had to balance a curriculum where we had to, definitely balance the practicum of proper industrial design education, the visual sketching, the form making, the appropriate fundamentals when it comes to composition, typography, and color theory, and all the things that we learn in these environments. Appreciation for the latest in digital tools. In this world, they could all live together. We could figure out how to use all these ingredients, all these approaches, and then ideally get to forms that perhaps weren't achievable with classical techniques some years ago. And I would say every one of our studios wasn't necessarily just the object or the presentation of a form and saying, this is what I designed. It had to be like, what is the actual story that's going to excite someone to want to invest in this idea? That was the new imperative for every studio. We had to show up with a set of presentation material that basically mirrored any pitch that you would make to a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. So we had to really articulate, for whatever idea we're thinking of, does this really matter? Is it desirable to people? Is it feasible? So through prototyping and technology investigation, is it feasible? Can you actually make this work? And do we have confidence that it can work one day? And then lastly, is there a business model here? Can it make money? Is it business viable? So those three ingredients were essentially the requirement of every studio. And very much, we had to convince ourselves and our faculty and the volunteer critics that we were out there in the field, understanding these frictions that are out there waiting to be solved. And so these are just a few snaps of my graduate thesis where, because of my Nike background, passion for athletics, I wanted to serve the endurance running community in some way, shape, or form. And so that meant getting out of the school, getting out into the field, and immersing with the folks that are in this world. And so this is us hanging out at a running clinic in Santa Monica and picking apart sort of the coaches' techniques in terms of how they engage runners, how they motivate the people that are taking this class, and understanding the individual aims of each of these people that are participating. And through all those interactions, sketching, prototyping, showing these folks use cases. I remember going to a lot of running events around the LA area, propping up tents, showcasing prototypes and getting feedback from people that were really doing this, people that were really committed and passionate about this field, and ending up with physical and digital value propositions that could help the runner's experience. So for this sort of final presentation, it was essentially proposing a finger-mounted wearable so that I could enable a runner to control music and coaching applications without having to stare at a giant phablet phone screen when they're trying to run, trying to cross traffic, ideally not tripping over themselves. What can we design to really enable someone that's interested and passionate about endurance running to stay in the groove and not have to feel distracted by digital technology and still get the benefits of things like music and coaching systems to help them along their path. And it was this project and helping other entrepreneurs in the LA area with similar types of projects that introduced me ultimately to the founding partners of what is now our organization. So this was just a case study that I could talk about that represented the process that I go through as a multidisciplinary creative. And through the process of that, this is back in 2012, as I was wrapping up Art Center. I met these folks, and it was probably five guys that had long backgrounds in management consulting, experiences helping large corporates, executives running those businesses. But these same guys also stepped into some business turnaround situations. They actually had to step into companies and service operators themselves and run marketing organizations, digital organizations, strategy organizations. And I think from their travels, they saw the perils of what we call waterfall when it comes to driving digital and exploring growth for these big corporates. And so through their travels, like what typically happens as they're meeting these or serving these senior executives is that a lot of times these large corporations will work with a strategy firm for a while, for many millions of dollars for weeks at a time. Then that strategy firm will hand over a PowerPoint deck recommendation to a design firm that will work so many weeks for a while. And then the handoff then keeps going to a couple of technology implementing firms. And so many handoffs later, so many millions of dollars later, you might be able to realize something that is tangible, some prototype that you can actually test and market and get feedback and understand if this is going to be a scalable business or not. And usually 8 times out of 10, it stops. It ends up in failure, and we didn't learn fast enough. Meanwhile, Silicon Valley and some of the emerging tech startups are driving and testing at 10 times the speed, able to get traction in market much faster. And so that waterfall process has proved perilous for many large corporates. So our thesis was, well, what do you get when you bring all these disciplines together at the table from day one, and then team with a large corporate that has all this know-how, has all this brand, cachet, distribution, expertise, and maybe even IP that we could all leverage together. And if we actually join forces, what could you then get? So that thesis of multidisciplinary collaboration and teaming with large corporates sort of helped us inform our mission statement, which is to really work together to invent, launch, and scale game-changing businesses with the world's most important companies. And through our early forays of cutting our teeth in this model, we attracted some of the interest of some very large players that were interested in our capability. Bethune Company was the first management consulting firm that was global. They gave us our first platform. They called us BCG Digital, so they brought us on board, and at that time we were 10 people. In over a year's time we grew to 70. And some really cool work was just jumping into our lap. We were working with the likes of Microsoft, Eli Lilly, other big corporates. And then unfortunately and fortunately, Bethune Company sold themselves to a much bigger player in PricewaterhouseCoopers. And that wasn't necessarily the right parent company organization for our team, and so we decided to leave. Well, thankfully, bigger players like BCG and McKinsey saw the work that we were doing at BCG Digital and made a play at the founding team. So at the start of 2014, BCG won that battle, and most of the founding team came over to BCG, and they rebranded us as BCG Digital Ventures. And so the next few slides, and before I hand it over to Lemare, just give you a sense of how we work in practice. And you'll see that this multidisciplinary notion isn't theory, that we try to bring it to life every day. So, through our process, I'll just explain at a high level. We take our large corporate partners through essentially a 3-step process. We live together in our innovation space, and we navigate a 12 to 14 week innovation sprint. So if any of you are familiar with design thinking, or essentially the creative process in general, now we're taking the multidisciplinary team through that creative journey to get to the investment thesis at the end of it. So just like the thesis that I described, from Art Center, it's very much a similar idea. This is how we show up to the end of that 14-week journey, considering a huge host of ideas, but then converging on the investment theses that we believe will win. And then that same team will go and continue to build it because they have the creative chops, the technology chops, and the business chops to see this as a new venture opportunity. And then we'll scale and commercialize the business. And at some point, the businesses may leave our nest and become their own entities. So it's been a really cool thing to witness, to see these things leave the nest and become their own successful businesses. So again, in a very creative way, it involves us being out in the field and not within our office walls to ensure that we're picking up on the frictions that are affecting real people. We travel a lot, we engage a lot, we immerse a lot, We use a whole host of open source techniques to really understand the attitudes, behaviors, and motivations of people in the field. And not treating them as a subject, but treating them as a participant, a co-creator, a collaborator, and solving real human problems that are out there. That's the spirit of what we try to do. And we've designed a space that really fosters the insights that we bring back to our home base, these innovation centers that are very much designed like multidisciplinary beehives that try to respect the modalities of all the different actors in each team. So we have these large venture rooms that allow that creative collision to naturally happen between these different disciplines. We actually create a lot of room for abductive thinking, so a lot of bottoms-up analysis of the things that we're bringing back from the field. We're not just asserting an answer on day one like, let's say, a management consultant might do on day one. We allow things to percolate so that we can see some of the non-obvious patterns. And, experience comes in many shapes and flavors, and so we're not a shop that's app first, or website first, or cloud first. It's like, what is the friction, and what are the full gamut of things that we could design, whether it be a connected device, an app, website, whatever it might be, a space. What can we weave together to make the most logical experience happen for the end users? So I think through my path at least, I'm very much passionate about this notion of human-centered co-creation and collaboration, testing constantly, getting input constantly, getting collaboration outside of your office walls constantly is especially important. And then secondly, really enabling that startup audacity. So why should Silicon Valley have all the fun? If we actually just work together in this way, most of the time, if not just some of the time, we can truly enable a startup audacity. And digital shouldn't be first. We shouldn't create these solutions and push it on people. We don't want to push solutions in search for a home. We really want to understand the friction that's out there and leverage digital to really connect human beings together and ensure that they're digesting relevant information so that they naturally want to do the things that they naturally want to do. And we're not just constraining them to a contrived experience. And ideally, the startups that we're trying to create and champion are really about provoking holistic ecosystems of opportunity across commerce, content, community, no matter the problem that we're focused on. And ideally, we're providing new channels to deliver empathic relationships. And again, not just pushing technology in search for a home. So I know that was a mouthful. I'm going to now pass it to Mer, who's going to share his story, and then we're definitely going to open it up for Q&A.
All right, so, Mer is my name. My mom and dad were music teachers and decided to give me a name related to a French composer, Claude Debussy. It's not easy with my name, but I've actually come to love it. So I managed to pick two of the most expensive art forms to try to practice, architecture and filmmaking. So I'm going to walk you a little bit of the journey that required of me, and then how I landed with Kevin and team. And I have to say, this guy is one of the most brilliant play callers and collaborators I've ever met. So you'll see that in the discussion about the team and how we work together. So this first thing here is related to where we are today. This idea of the era of business that we're now in, which I think is great that we have business students, we have design students, hopefully some tech students and or hobby tech people. But they're all converging in really, really interesting ways. Not just here, not just at our company, but across industries, across cultures. So this is also a slide that has a book that at the firm, 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, who's a very interesting, complex character within the startup space. Things like PayPal, Palantir, these are all properties that he has been involved in setting up. And our CEO really loves the audacity involved in this notion of this book and what it's about, of taking the kernel of an idea and very quickly pushing it out in some size, shape, and form, and seeing where you get, and then continue to push it and push it and push it. So there's an aggression, there's a, let's call it a spirit of invention that is involved in digital that's like no other. The other thing you see here conceptually is the idea that all you need is a laptop, a few accoutrements, and off you go to building something you've never seen before. So an incredible era you guys are living in. I just encourage you to kind of think about things that you're able to create that have never been out there before. So this is kind of an inspiring thing for me in terms of how I grew up, and I'll take you back and we'll go forward, but the notion of where we live within the space of adoption. This idea of being very unique and different and creative and innovator, very small subset are truly in that space. And this is really where we strive to be with Digital Ventures as much as we can. The reality is we're dealing with the market, and we're dealing with folks who actually love being in the late majority, because that's where a lot of the big financial wins are. Much easier to play there. But what we know from invention is that you kind of need to play in the early majority space to build a brand, to build a story, to build a future. Where you don't want to be is a laggard, trust me. So the notion of how that space also works and how we can have a virtuous loop of bringing people that are really afraid into the future, that's our mission. This is also kind of interesting in terms of how it layers back to the whole notion of how we work as a society around what we accept and what we don't accept, how we need sometimes social proof, and how that proof can lead to things being accepted and or becoming frozen and rigid. So if you've never heard of the Overton window, it's actually a really interesting concept to just familiarize yourself with when you're dealing with a concept that you're trying to put forth and it's not quite being accepted. It might just be too early, or it might be a little bit too late. You'll find out. This crazy diagram, I love the complexity of it. Every time I show it to someone, they get angry with, I can't read all of it. I don't get it. What are you trying to say here? Well, the gist of the message is really contained in the four main circles here. The idea of what the business goals are, as you heard Kevin speak about, testing that out up front, what the interaction is and the behavior that you expect someone to do with that business opportunity, what that individual is doing with that opportunity and how they work together with that, and the content that you place within it to make it all come to life. And then the surrounding areas are really how we actually bring things to the surface with regard to the process of creating artifacts. Most of what we do in my group, the Experience Design group, ends up on screens or as stories. But sometimes it comes out as actual physical graphic designs or even interior designs at some point. But this whole notion of the ecosystem of things and activities that we do to bring life to our concepts is pretty rigorous, actually. So I'm going to pause here and kind of talk a little bit about the space that we're in. It's been 1,240 days. I did the calcs last night. I've got the minutes too, but you don't want to hear that. But the notion of stepping into this world of Tier 1 consultancy was not something that came easy to me, and I'll talk to you a little bit about when it was. But the idea of building a new entity, and one key word kind of came out as we were starting to think about the brand 2 years ago, which was this idea of being an enigma and enigmatic. What can you label yourself as without limiting yourself? And allowing the company to ebb and flow as opportunities surface, and not, let's say, pigeonholing yourself into a particular way of working, a particular archetype of people that you hire. It's been interesting to try to depict a company that does almost, let's say, almost CIA levels of secrecy for our clients to make sure we're not releasing their investment. And at the same time, expressing ourselves in a way that's attractive to folks like yourselves wanting to know more about the company. And lastly, that we're proud of how we're expressing who we are and our visual aesthetic and its alignment with our purpose and goals. So this is a design system, and if any of you have taken web and or interactive and or mobile classes, you'll relate to the kind of rabbit's warren of complexity that comes to life when you start to look at trying to communicate all these different messages across different viewports and so forth. So the idea of really going in and effectively creating a full-on brand system for the company. We've got, what, 12 offices now, I think, or more. And they're all doing different activities, and how do you align them and make sure that they're actually presenting consistently? We also were building out the video kind of library and I would say the notion of how we communicate ourselves with video and storytelling has been so critical for our success. We often get a lot of really, really strong reactions to the style, of course, but the story and how we're depicting the future and or present. It's really a key component. So if you're actually working with video already, hats off to you. If not, I encourage you to use your phone or any device to use video. So here's what we want to show a couple of things here. So as this is coming up, this is a animation that we put together probably early last year. We were being very enigmatic. I take a lot of arrows for that word, but nonetheless, that was a strategy. But we started to get the comfort level with who we were to be able to express ourselves.
Introducing BCG Digital Ventures. The world of business continues to be radically disrupted by startup companies. When managed well, startups change millions of lives and generate immense value. But often, they struggle with scaling the business and fade away, leaving communities of customers behind with no revenue or financial return. Meanwhile, wealthy Fortune 1000 corporations are limited by quarterly numbers, prioritizing short-term incentive over long-term growth. With trillions in inactive capital, they have all they need to change billions of lives. But maintaining market positions forces them to ignore the threat of digital attackers. Unable to play offense, they are being disrupted by vertical growth startups. BCGDV was created to combine the best of both worlds. Scrappy, collaborative, insight-driven startup culture, leveraging the speed of startups with the resources of corporations. Working to invent, build, launch, and scale new ventures. BCGDV builds businesses that are beyond belief. We are expanding our presence around the world. Join us at pollen.bcgdv.com.
So that was a quick little intro that we give people to understand when we're orienting them to the company. Every month we've got about 10 to 20 people in each office coming in. I think we're at about 600 people globally now. So it's constant growth, constant orientation to who we are and what we do and why. So, lessons learned. The velocity that business moves is like nothing I've experienced before. The audacity, that's a key word, of actually having someone like a partner or a CEO walk in and say, hey, I want to see this happen within 14 weeks, and it happens. We've got such an amazing, talented team. We don't always know how we're going to do what we do, but we end up doing something amazing. Then we transfer over to actually building out the product during an incubation, is what this calls. The idea of actually spending a year and doing the research, digging in, and actually using the code and the systems that go into making real products is very, very accelerated. My experience in agencies, we're working at about 3 to 5 times as fast as they are. And it shows in terms of how the clients respond to the work that we're putting out there. Another lesson has been the scale of thought of business philosophy is, I worked on building before. It just, there's a notion of designing ecosystems, full-on ecosystems, and having no hesitation to think that you can do what hasn't been done before. It's extremely exhilarating, also frightening. I would say a third lesson has been that creativity can live within the business context. This was not something I expected. When I interviewed a little bit hesitantly, this was because one of my former students from Art Center had begun to work with Booz and Company, as Kevin mentioned. And I had the WTF response to that, which was, I've worked with consultants before, and they come in and they cut costs and they do all these things, and why are you joining the dark side? And so I said, I don't know if I want to go through the process of figuring this out. But he said, look, it's about the talent. It's about the people that are working together to create something new. And this is also an industry evolution. And this is the biggest lesson that I've had, which is watching the notion of transmedia, which I had in grad school back in the early 2000s, was real now. people didn't have those boundaries anymore. And I think that's true for you guys as well. So in doing so, the idea of how you actually engage, how you get your point across, how you have an intention and an endeavor in mind was really also a huge learning curve for me and many of the folks that I hired. I think the group was probably at about 55 just in the experience design team here in LA, one of the biggest cohorts in the company. I took bets on a lot of the younger folks because I thought that and still do believe that the notion of how you guys are able to adapt to the new world in ways that some folks who've been through different companies and different journeys may or may not be able to conceptually wrap their minds around as fast as you could. And so we're watching them grow to become much more mature in the system, and the speed and audacity that they take on in their work as designers is really impressive. However, the social interaction, how you actually work with people, this is where we've also had huge learnings. And a lot of what I also taught at Art Center was related to the topic of ethics and communication, composure, all those factors. So it's been really stretching me in a lot of ways. So that's definitely been something I've had to figure out how to play. So this slide is actually dedicated to that topic. I don't know if you guys have seen this skit from back in the day with Dave Chappelle, but the idea of disrespect and disregard for how they think about, and they with a capital T, how people who aren't sensitized to what creativity is, to what craft is, to what vision and ideation, how delicate those things are at some point, they don't care. Right? And there's this notion of the aggression of business. It's a very contrast-driven conversation that will be had about whether this works or doesn't work. And I've had people come crying in the same way that people used to cry in the architecture studios at USC when I was there. I've had people really want to quit in the same ways that they wanted to quit when they were at Art Center when I was there. So it's part of the maturation process, and we've been able to keep a lot of folks on the path and really push themselves. But it's a phenomenon you're going to experience in some way, shape, or form. Whether you're in the world of innovation or you're in the world of just traditional business, there will be challenges to your perspective, and you've got to know how to deal with people who don't have the same viewpoint and/or are just cracks. So my take on the world is kind of looking at it with a comedic lens to a certain degree. There is a notion of how we're actually all learning through the paths that we follow and the interactions we have with people who may or may not, let's say, wish you well. But being able to express things through your work, being able to synthesize what's happened and present it back in a very interesting way, and to have the humanity and the empathy around their perspective and why did they think that, and maybe you can come together and work together, maybe not, but nonetheless, it's all a really rich life experience. And so there's been a lot of comedy as well at DV, where we've actually been building out this amazing engine, and people come in and they marvel at the space and they marvel at the amount of work, but there have been like gigantic explosions of activity and stress and strain. It's only 3 years and 8 months or 9 months old. It's not even a fully formed baby yet. So it's kind of an interesting time, and this notion of looking at things as though they were opportunities to learn and to laugh has been key. So where I'm right now is I'm kind of geeking out on blockchain, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that and its relation to my past. But the idea of where this is going, if you haven't been listening or seeing these things emerge in your social feeds, I encourage you just to investigate it a little bit. It's kind of the payoff of what my generation, the kind of 90s, 2000s babies thought the internet was going to be and thought connectivity could be. The potential is there, but on top of that is all the economic benefits and economic system design that you guys, whether you're in architecture, business or not, can really bring about in a world that's phenomenal. So, flashing back to yesterday, I'm not that old, but we did have some of those tools back in my day in architecture school. We had physical devices to actually help us draw and everything. But this idea of where I grew up is kind of a good frame as well. You know, my parents were music teachers, and I had 4 sisters and 1 brother, and they all played instruments. I'm the 4th, and I was defiant. I'm going to be drawing. I'm not going to be doing that goofy trumpet stuff. So be it. But the idea of being creative and the idea of being expressive was key to our household. And it was also key, I think, to a lot of what we paid attention to in terms of the television shows, the films, and so forth. Having a very unique take on the world was really key, and I think that's actually been a driving force in why I've chosen a lot of the career turns and twists that I've taken, and had no qualms about how it turned out. USC. So I came from Louisiana and then showed up on the campus of USC in the 90s, and man, what a shock to my system. I think the notion of either doing business or architecture, it was really where my mind was, and I chose architecture because I thought I was tough, and it ended up being the case that I was being tested. So this idea of being passionate about what you're doing and not having a lot of resources and being resourceful because of that, really looking at the history as well as the future context, those were all things that were really driving me. And the campus was also small enough where I could actually traverse the city, the little mini city, in the way that I wanted to, which is kind of like all your campuses. I was remarking earlier about how beautiful it is to be on a small, contained campus. But things like meeting Frank Gehry and the other kind of major architects when they would come and lecture and discuss things was really, really wonderful. I still think back to a lot of those days. So during my second year, there was a kind of shift in how we're starting to work, and I was really starting to push on the idea of materiality. These were all notions of how do we make things in the world. I'd been on little construction sites with my dad and others kind of doing the hobby construction, but once we actually started to do visits to architect offices and contractors, I loved materiality. And there was an interesting second-year professor that was making everyone nervous about how their work was turning out, and was it crap, and are you working hard enough, and I don't believe in you, you don't believe in yourself, those kinds of plays. And this was my second semester, second year, and I didn't want to go back home. I wanted to stay this summer, but somehow I decided to take this studio. And it was with a guy named Norman Millar. And Norman was going through an interesting period. I think that was his last semester teaching at the school. But for whatever reason, we got along really well. He would push me and I would push him. And he had the studio come up to his place in Echo Park before Echo Park was cool. And again, this whole notion of corrugated metal and steel, we had infinite conversations about how that was actually a really interesting way to work because of its affordability and how you could use that for an aesthetic device. It was a really fun summer. And then he moved over to SciArc and had a really good run there, and then he came here. And I remember him kind of letting everyone in the network know, and I was like, wow, that's really interesting because you're going to probably do something really unique. It was him and another instructor named Jay Nichols, I think, at the time. And the notion was there was a student body that he really liked interacting with because they were different. And it was always really inspiring to kind of hear him talk about that. And I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but basically I had been working in an architecture firm a little bit during the summer, and I was a little bit frustrated. I talked with him, he wrote me a letter of recommendation, and he kind of opened my eyes up to look at pretty much anything that instinctually was going to work for me. And so that ended up being working with some crazy set and production design folks. So this shot actually was given to me by the guy that was on my first job. He was both a director and a director of photography. He had been an architect for a while. He was from South Africa, and we were there working on this insane schedule at the Paramount lot. And he turns to me and he's yelling at me about something that was going wrong, and I didn't know what I was doing. And he pulls me aside and asks me, "What are you studying?" I didn't even finish it. He was like, "Yeah, you look like it." So it was kind of one of those things where there's just kind of a intensity that he had that was really interesting in the work that came out. It was actually a Coors Light commercial. I hate beer, but it was one of the most fun environments to be in, and it really showed me both advertising as well as high velocity, high intensity creativity being applied. So, working for about a year and a half, kind of part-time with the set design world, I wanted to finish my degree, so that meant getting a little bit more time in the offices, and I worked with an architect, Mer Walker, with Borsky and Canon at the time. And one of the first things they had me work on was a project in El Sereno. And for the architects and all this, there's an old saying about, if you can, work far away from when you work on your first project, when you build your first project, because chances are you'll drive by and look at it and cry. So this shot is from probably 5 years ago. It doesn't look like that anymore. There were things that we did on that building that made no sense. We used hand trowel stucco, which is a very delicate kind of finish. You don't do that in Hood. You just don't. I could go off about it, but nonetheless, it's one of those things where I was kind of discovering what it was like to see the finished product of a lot of work. So there were probably about 6 or 7 buildings in California that I worked on. So in the process of seeing things get built, I was missing my digital experiments. We had done a lot of work in the computer labs at USC, and I just really loved the way that was a convergence of concept, of quick sketching, of communication design. So I decided to go to Art Center and do a grad program there. And at the time, it was really more of a umbrella program, graduate industrial design. We had some pretty unique department chairs that were running the program, and they brought in Debbie, and she actually brought back a couple of books that we went through, and it was kind of an intellectual stew that I really loved. I think looking back on it, some of the rigor that was missing, I don't know that I missed it per se, but it was a really intellectually stimulating time where I was across pretty much every department, taking classes, dropping classes, just filling up my schedule in my mind as much as I could. So while I was there, I also got into the film kind of world quite a bit, and from there, the advertising space really opened up because that was right when digital became really viable for people in the advertising space. And so I didn't care much for the big agencies. I had visited several of them, and it just seemed like the work was good, but the culture was really important to me. So I liked the idea of working at a small boutique, and I found one in a little small place called Carlsbad that was punching way above their weight. They had done a lot of really high-end, fashion-driven campaigns and cinematic look and feel work for spirits, for automotive, for fashion brands. And so I went down and joined them, and it's probably about 70 people at the time. And they basically had me for about a month and said, hey, start an interactive department. You, just go. I was like, of course. So we grew to about 10 people, and we started to work on all the different campaign activation elements. And then we got a client that came by, Campari, which is an Italian brand. If you don't know it, or you've tried it, chances are you don't like it here in the States. But they were looking to actually expand their presence here, and they had bought several of the brands that we were already working with. So our notion was to bring them to life in the arts, as well as their traditional Italian heritage. So the first thing that came to mind was, let's do a calendar like Pirelli does. And this is the image you see here of choosing Salma as the first Latin lady. So that was a shoot that we did in Prague with a very, very cool and high-end photographer, Mario Tessino. It was a great time. So that studio and agency, we worked primarily in the luxury space. So you'll see things here from hotels to home electronics to an architecture-inspired vodka, which, by the way, we had Zaha Hadid, which is where I met her. She actually did not like the bottle and couldn't understand our campaign and told us as much. It was fun. To an automotive launch for a Fisker Automotive, which was an interesting brand that evolved and had some issues, but we had a lot of fun in the photo shoot. To illustration campaigns from Grand Marnier, to wholesome brands like Dasani and Coca-Cola, and it was a lot of fun. Very intense, but a lot of fun. So After about 7 years of working with those folks, I wanted to be back in LA and moved back up and started working with ABC Television in their interactive department. And what we were doing there was actually going and working on all the different concepts for emerging shows, existing shows, and the Oscars. And that was an interesting kind of client-side experience that I had. And that's also when I started teaching at Art Center. I'd been coming up to the school and complaining about the talent, not knowing what I needed them to know, and of course they said, well, teach them. So I taught there for about 4.5 years and met amazing people, just really amazing people. And my goal was to try to tailor something for them every time they came in the class, or even when they weren't in class, but especially giving them what I would have wanted to have, which was some sort of exposure to things that were possible that I hadn't considered yet. Tomorrow. So just looking at things I wish someone had told me about. I mentioned before blockchain. If I had known what I know now about the late 90s and looking at digital and interactive, I would have gone far more aggressively into the web design space that I was working in. It was very casual. It was kind of like, yeah, let's do a website for the developer we're working with. I would have gone much harder in the paint on that. And for you, I think looking at these emergent spaces, augmented reality, virtual reality, as I mentioned, the economic possibilities of blockchain, there's several things that I think that you guys can look at and really delve deeply into that I think are going to be really transformative for you and for everyone in your ecosystem. The other thing is the notion of how economics work. Kevin often says this phrase that I tweaked my head the first time. I was like, what does he mean? Not all dollars are the same. Meaning sometimes there are investment opportunities or work opportunities that come with such a payload is not worth your time, and other times there are exponential things within that you can't quite see. So being able to understand that system as a business person would, as a creative would, as a technologist would, that's really key and important. And I think the third thing I would say is, placing yourself within the time that we're living and thinking through how you want to grow and how you want to chart out an economic plan for yourself, very powerful. So I just encourage you to do so. So this idea of the time we live in, right, is the notion of the generation mapping, right, where we have the generation X, the Ys, I think you guys are considered Z, is that right? And all the characteristics that go along with that, they often get touted, and even in my daily conversations with the marketing team, millennial, I can't say the word anymore, it's just getting old. I don't necessarily subscribe to those hard lines. I would say I'm much more intrigued with how the discipline walls are dropping and your ability to collaborate, to communicate is like none before. And so choosing pathways that you don't necessarily know the concrete result of, I think is required of you now. It's certainly something that we're engaging in constantly as we're looking at innovation, incubation, what are the results, let's pull back, try it again. It's really important to be fluid and flexible this time. So this idea of adding value, this definitely came through with the Digital Ventures experience. Again, the idea of having creatives and business people come together to explore and to investigate what might happen, and then taking bets and having accountability for those bets. That's a way you can add value, is actually having the resourcefulness and the expansiveness to think about things in a different way that might be immediately considered by people who have succeeded in the past. And lastly, have patience. Debbie, I think she's been very concerned over the years. Like, what are you doing? What is this script thing you wrote? Like, you wrote a comedy about architects and bankers. Why? I'll read it, but why? Right? And I never questioned myself. Maybe that's just the arrogance that I have and don't know it, but it's starting to add up now. And I just encourage you to think about your time differential with opportunity, the investments that you make, and fate. It just works that way. So, thank you.